The notary set the deed on the table with that soft final sound paper makes when it changes everything, and my sister reached for it with both hands like she'd been waiting her whole life to hold something that was never really hers to take. What neither of them knew was that I'd been paying the mortgage on that house for 11 years. My mother's signature was still wet on the transfer documents when she looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in months and said, "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but family comes first." And I just sat there, in the same chair where I'd helped her fill out the refinancing paperwork 3 years ago, watching her give away something I'd been keeping afloat while she was busy pretending I didn't exist. You want to know what it feels like to be the invisible daughter until the bills come due? Let me tell you about the day my mother remembered I was real and decided it didn't matter. I'm Dee, and around here, we don't just survive it, we understand it. If you've ever been the one who shows up when it's hard and gets forgotten when it's easy, you're not watching this alone. Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you know exactly what this kind of silence feels like, the kind that has a temperature. My name is Claire, and I'm 38 years old. My sister Rachel is 34, and she's always been the golden child, the one who called on holidays, posted the right photos on Facebook, showed up to family dinners with store-bought desserts and perfect hair. I was the one who moved back home when Dad got sick, the one who learned how to administer his medications, who sat up with him during the nights when the pain got bad, who held his hand when he forgot what year it was, but still remembered to ask if I'd eaten. For 3 years, I was my father's nurse, my mother's emotional support daughter, and the only person in that house who noticed when the utilities got shut off because no one was paying them. When Dad died, Mom couldn't keep up with the house. Too much space, too many memories, too much maintenance for a 70-year-old woman living alone. That's when she asked me to help her refinance. "Just until I get back on my feet," she said, sitting at the kitchen table with those papers spread out like a deck of cards. "You've got the better credit, sweetheart, and you're working. I'll pay you back every month, I promise." She never paid me back, not once. But I kept paying the mortgage anyway, because where else was she going to go? Because Dad's memory was still in those walls, in the way the floorboards creaked in the hallway, in the garden he'd planted that I still watered every Sunday morning. Because I thought that's what family did. You held things together when they started falling apart, even when no one was keeping score. Except someone was keeping score, just not the way I thought. Rachel had been living in the city, building her career, posting her brunch photos and her weekend getaways. She called on birthdays. She sent cards at Christmas. She never once asked how much the mortgage was, or whether Mom could afford the property taxes, or why I'd turned down 2 job offers in other states because I couldn't leave. But she showed up fast enough when Mom mentioned the house was paid off. Here's what I didn't know then, and what you need to understand before we go any further. My mother had been telling Rachel for months that the house was hers, that it would be hers. While I was writing checks every month, while I was covering the insurance, while I was fixing the water heater and calling the roofer and making sure the pipes didn't freeze, my mother was making promises I didn't know she was making. And the worst part? She'd already moved Rachel into the guest room 3 weeks before that notary appointment. 3 weeks. While I was still sleeping in my childhood bedroom, still making coffee for Mom in the morning, still believing we were a team. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before all of that, there was the email that should have warned me. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was standing in the frozen foods aisle, trying to decide between the brand name lasagna and the store brand. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I almost didn't check it because I was carrying that specific kind of exhaustion that settles deep in your bones after 3 years of being everyone's designated emergency contact. But something made me look. It was from my mother, with a subject line that just read, "House Update." I remember thinking she was finally going to acknowledge that I had paid the last mortgage installment, Or maybe she was going to offer to pay me back now that the refinancing period was officially over. I was so incredibly naive. The email was exactly 3 sentences long. She wrote that she had made the decision to transfer the house to Rachel because Rachel needed stability more than I did, and she had promised to be there for Mom long term. She ended it by saying she knew I would understand because family comes first. There was no explanation for why Rachel, who lived 300 miles away and visited exactly twice a year, needed stability more than the daughter literally living in the house, caring for her, and keeping the lights on. I stood there in the fluorescent lighting of the grocery store, holding a cardboard box of lasagna, and felt something crack inside my chest. It wasn't the dramatic breaking you see in movies, just a quiet, precise fracture, like a hairline crack in porcelain that you know will eventually split the whole thing in two. I put the lasagna back on the shelf. I wasn't hungry anymore. When I got home, Mom was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, looking peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in months. She smiled when I walked in and asked if I had gotten her email, and her voice was so light, so casual, like she had just told me she was changing the cable package instead of giving away the house I had been keeping afloat. I sat down across from her and folded my shaking hands in my lap so she wouldn't see. I told her that I had been paying the mortgage for 3 years, every single month, and I kept my voice perfectly steady, reading the numbers to her like I was reciting from a bank statement. I listed the exact dates. I listed the late fees I had absorbed when her automatic payments bounced. I listed the cost of the new roof she had begged me to handle because she was on a fixed income. The total came to exactly $41,612. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just laid the numbers on the table between us, right next to her cooling tea. She just waved her hand, completely dismissive, and told me she knew and was grateful, but Rachel needed this more because she was thinking about settling down and having children someday. She told me I was the responsible one, the one who always figured things out, while Rachel was the dreamer who needed a safety net. You have to understand the particular cruelty of a mother who uses your resilience as an excuse to rob you. How do you look at the woman who gave you life and realize she sees you as nothing more than a human ATM? Rachel didn't need stability. Rachel needed a down payment she couldn't afford, and a place to host the wedding she had been bragging about on social media for 6 months. I knew this because I had seen the venue brochures left on Mom's counter, the ones for a botanical garden that required a $10,000 non-refundable deposit. It is a very specific type of grief, realizing your parent doesn't just prefer your sibling. They actively view you as a resource to be mined so your sibling can shine. Mom wasn't giving Rachel the house out of love. She was giving her the equity. The house was worth $400,000, with maybe $150,000 left on the mortgage I was paying, meaning she was handing over $250,000 in a single afternoon, without a single phone call to discuss it. And she was expecting me to just quietly absorb the loss, to keep paying the property taxes and the insurance, to keep being the invisible foundation so Rachel could build her perfect little life on top of my stolen ground. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and realized she had already rehearsed this conversation in her head. But what she didn't know yet was that I had already started keeping my own records, and that binder in my desk was about to become the most dangerous thing in this house. I want you to picture that binder, 3 inches thick, filled with canceled checks, bank statements, and printed emails. I thought it was my shield. I thought it was the undeniable proof I would slam on the kitchen table when Rachel inevitably tried to push me out. But a shield is only useful if you know what weapon is actually coming at you. The next morning, I went out to the mailbox before the dew had even burned off the grass. The house felt different already. The air was thinner, like the oxygen had been sucked out the moment Mom hit send on that email. Inside the metal box was a thick, official-looking envelope from the mortgage servicer. I recognized the logo immediately. I assumed it was the final payoff statement, or maybe the updated deed confirmation now that Mom had pushed the paperwork through over the weekend. I actually felt a tiny, foolish spark of relief. I thought, okay, at least the bank has it in writing that I'm the one who cleared the balance. I tore it open right there on the porch, standing next to the hydrangeas Dad had planted 20 years ago. But as my eyes scanned the dense, legal-sized text, the words didn't say what I expected them to say. And this is where I need you to listen very carefully, because what this letter actually said is the exact moment the floor dropped out from under us. The letter was addressed to Rachel, not to Mom, not to me, to Rachel. It stated that, per the new owner's request, the payment profile had been officially updated. It explicitly noted that all past and future payments made from my personal checking account were now legally classified as rental income. And then, in bold font at the very bottom, it stated that as a non-borrower tenant, I held zero equity rights to the property, and that the new owner reserved the right to terminate my tenancy with a standard 30-day notice. Do you understand what that actually means? Mom hadn't just given the house to Rachel. She had gone to the bank and legally reclassified $41,000 of my money as rent. She had turned my lifeline into a lease. And by doing so, she had just made it completely legal for Rachel to evict me from the house I paid for. Okay, I need to step out of the story for just 1 second, because my pulse is actually pounding right now. If you are sitting there thinking, Dee, she can't do that, it's fraud, you are thinking like a reasonable person. But toxic people don't play by reasonable rules. They play by the rules of the loophole. Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you have ever had a family member use a technicality to steal from you, because we need to validate how infuriating this is. You are not crazy. They are just ruthless. Back on the porch, I didn't realize the full, devastating weight of what I was holding. I just saw the words rental income, and my brain short-circuited. I thought it was a clerical error. I thought the bank had just miscategorized the payments because Mom had set up the auto-pay under her name originally. So I didn't panic. I just folded the letter, tucked it under my arm, and walked back inside to make coffee, completely unaware that the clock on my eviction had just started ticking. I poured my mug. I sat at the island. Mom came in a few minutes later, looking entirely too cheerful for a woman who had just stolen $250,000 from her daughter. She asked if the mail had arrived, and when I handed her the envelope, she didn't even open it. She just smiled, patted my hand, and said, "Good. Everything is exactly where it needs to be." She knew. She knew exactly what that letter said. She had probably drafted the request herself. She was sitting there, sipping her tea, looking at the daughter she had just legally reduced to a tenant, and she felt absolutely nothing but triumph. I spent the rest of the day organizing my binder, color-coding the receipts, preparing my argument for when Rachel showed up to demand the keys. I was building a case for a trial that had already been decided against me, but what I didn't know yet was that Rachel wasn't just coming for the keys. She was coming with the sheriff. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen island with my 3-inch binder, tracing the edges of the canceled checks with my thumb, waiting for the sun to come up. I kept telling myself it was a clerical error. I kept telling myself that once Mom saw the letter, she would call the bank and fix it, because that's what mothers do when they accidentally trap their daughters in a legal nightmare. But the house stayed quiet, and the coffee maker kept dripping, and the truth was just sitting there, waiting for the morning. When Rachel's car finally pulled into the driveway at 9 o'clock, she didn't come alone. She walked up the porch steps with the kind of brisk, unearned confidence that only comes from knowing you hold all the cards. And right behind her was a man in a tailored gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. He wasn't a friend. He wasn't a contractor. He was a shark in a cheap tie, and he was here to collect. Rachel didn't even say hello. She just walked into the kitchen, looked at the mug in my hand, and sighed like I was a stain on the counter she hadn't gotten around to scrubbing yet. She told me they needed to get the formalities out of the way so she could start measuring for the wedding centerpieces. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she didn't see a sister. She saw an obstacle that had already been cleared. The man in the suit introduced himself as Rachel's attorney, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened the briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of documents, and slid them across the granite island. It was a residential lease agreement. And this is the exact moment the legal trap I'd been staring at all night finally snapped shut. I picked up the first page, and my eyes scanned the dense text until the words stopped being letters and started being weapons. They hadn't just reclassified my payments as rent. They had backdated a verbal lease agreement to the exact month I started paying the mortgage, legally classifying every single dollar I had sent to the bank as a monthly rental fee, which meant I didn't own a single penny of equity in the house. I was just a tenant who had been paying above market rent to a landlord who happened to be my sister. Okay, I need to step out of the story for just a second because my hands are actually shaking typing this. If you are sitting there thinking a family member would never hire a lawyer to evict you from the house you paid for, you are underestimating the sheer, unadulterated greed of a golden child who finally got their hands on the trust fund. Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you have ever watched someone you loved turn into a stranger the second money got involved, because we need to talk about how quickly blood turns to water when there's equity on the line. Back in the kitchen, Rachel was already tapping on her phone, probably texting her fiancé about the square footage of the master bedroom. She didn't even look up when her attorney told me I had 30 days to vacate the premises, or that if I stayed past the deadline, they would file for a formal eviction and garnish my wages for the unpaid balance of the lease. She just smiled, a tiny, vicious little smirk, and told me I should probably start packing my childhood bedroom. You know what the funniest part is? She actually thought I was going to cry. She thought I was going to beg, or throw a tantrum, or call mom to come save me. But I didn't do any of those things. I just reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and opened the camera app. I asked the attorney to hold the lease up to the light so I could photograph every single page, including the signature page where mom had forged my name as a cosigner. Forged. She hadn't just reclassified the payments. She had literally forged my signature on a legal document to make the lease binding. And in that exact second, the grief that had been suffocating me for 48 hours just evaporated, replaced by a clarity so sharp it could cut glass. I lowered my phone, looked Rachel dead in the eye, and told her I would need a copy of everything for my records. She laughed. She actually laughed and told me I didn't need copies because I wasn't on the deed anymore. But I wasn't asking for the deed. I was asking for the evidence. I want you to hold on to that distinction because Rachel is about to learn the difference between owning a house and owning a crime scene. The front door clicked shut behind them, and the silence that rushed back into the kitchen was so heavy it felt like it had its own gravity. I stood there for a long time, just listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Rachel's car engine fading down the street. Most people in my position would have started throwing things. They would have called the police, or screamed until their throat bled, or called mom and begged her to undo it. But I didn't do any of that. I just walked over to the kitchen island, sat down, and opened the banking app on my phone. I navigated to the bill pay section. I found the automatic transfer I had set up 3 years ago, the one that sent exactly $1,840 to the mortgage servicer on the first of every month. And I deleted it. It is a profound thing, the exact moment you stop bailing out a sinking ship and just sit on the dock to watch it go under. Let me ask you something. If your sister and your mother decide to legally classify you as a tenant, and they decide to keep all the equity of the home you paid for, who exactly do they think is going to pay the mortgage now? Rachel was the owner. Rachel was the landlord. And landlords, as a general rule, are responsible for the mortgage. I packed my bags that afternoon. I didn't take anything that wasn't legally mine. I took my clothes, my 3-inch binder, my laptop, and the photo albums Dad had kept on the top shelf of his closet. When I walked out to my car, I didn't look back at the house. I just got in, started the engine, and drove to a cheap extended stay motel on the edge of town. For the first 3 days, my phone didn't ring. I imagine Rachel was busy measuring the walls for her wedding centerpieces, completely oblivious to the fact that the first of the month was rapidly approaching. On the 4th day, the mortgage payment was due. Now, I need you to understand how the banking system works when a payment profile is suddenly changed. The servicer doesn't just magically pull money from a new account. They need authorization. They need a new routing number. Rachel never set up a new payment method. She assumed my auto-pay would just keep running, because that's what it had done for 3 years. That is the absolute hallmark of a golden child. They don't just expect the world to provide for them. They expect the people they step on to keep sweeping the floor while they walk away. On the 5th of the month, the payment was late. On the 10th, the bank sent a late notice to the official owner of record, Rachel. I know this because I had set up an alert on my own email to notify me whenever the mortgage account status changed. I wasn't going to miss a single second of this. On the 15th, the bank initiated the grace period penalty. On the 20th, they sent a formal notice of default. And that is when the phone calls started. Not from Mom, from Rachel. She left 7 voicemails in a single hour. I didn't listen to them until I was sitting in my motel room, eating a bowl of instant oatmeal. Her voice was shrill, panicked, and completely devoid of the polished confidence she had worn like a suit of armor in my kitchen. She screamed that I was trying to ruin her wedding. She screamed that the bank was threatening to foreclose. She screamed that I needed to fix it immediately. I listened to the last voicemail twice. Then, I picked up my phone and I called her back. She answered on the first ring, hissed an insult, and demanded I pay the bank right now or she would sue me for everything I had. I let the silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds. Then I told her that I was a tenant, and tenants don't pay the mortgage. Landlords do. I could hear her breathing on the other end. Sharp, ragged, panicked breaths. I told her that since she had legally claimed the house, and since she had so graciously accepted all the equity, she was more than welcome to cover the remaining $150,000 on the loan. I told her I wished her the best with the wedding, and I hung up. But here is the thing about playing with legal documents. You can forge a signature, and you can reclassify a payment, but you cannot forge a credit score. Rachel didn't have the $150,000. She didn't have the $1,800. And because she had just taken legal ownership of a property she couldn't afford, she was about to find out exactly what happens when the bank comes to collect. But the foreclosure notice was only the first domino. Because while Rachel was busy panicking about the bank, she completely forgot about the other document I had photographed in my kitchen. The foreclosure notice didn't come in the mail. It came via a certified process server on a rainy Thursday morning. I was sitting in my motel room, drinking cheap coffee, when I looked out the window and saw him, walking up the driveway of the house I used to call home. Rachel was standing on the porch in her silk robe, screaming at the man in the windbreaker. She was waving her arms, pointing at the house, probably telling him he had the wrong address. But the server just handed her the thick yellow envelope, turned around, and walked back to his car. You see, when you legally claim a property as your own, you also legally claim its debts. And when you forge a signature to reclassify a mortgage payment as rent, you don't just create a lease. You create a paper trail of mortgage fraud. I didn't just sit in that motel room and wait for the bank to figure it out. I took my binder, I took the photographs of the forged lease, and I drove straight to the regional office of the mortgage servicer. I sat down with a loss mitigation specialist and I laid it all out. I explained that the new owner had submitted fraudulent documentation to alter the payment profile. I showed him the photos of the lease, pointing out the signature that was clearly a clumsy trace of my own handwriting. I told him that I, the actual payer of record, had never signed that document, and that I had ceased payments because the account had been illegally modified. The specialist didn't laugh. He didn't roll his eyes. He just looked at the photos, typed something into his computer, and made a phone call right there in front of me. Within 20 minutes, the account was flagged for suspected fraud, and the foreclosure process was immediately accelerated. The bank didn't just want their money. They wanted to know who had falsified their legal documents. When the investigators called Rachel, she did exactly what golden children always do when the illusion shatters. She blamed her mother. She told the bank that Mom had handled the paperwork, that Mom had forged the signature, that Mom had told her it was all perfectly legal. And just like that, the golden child threw the woman who stole $250,000 for her under the bus to save her own credit score. Mom called me that evening. Her voice was small, trembling, stripped of all that polished, righteous certainty she had worn at the kitchen table. She asked me to come over. She said we needed to fix this, that Rachel was just scared, that we were family. Let me pause right here, because I know exactly what some of you are thinking. You're thinking she's your mother. She made a mistake. No, she didn't make a mistake. She made a choice. She looked at her two daughters and decided one was an investment and the other was an expense. If you have ever had to choose between your own dignity and a parent's comfort, drop a fire emoji in the comments right now. You know exactly how heavy that phone felt when I held it. I didn't yell at Mom. I didn't tell her I hated her. I just told her that the house was in foreclosure, that the bank was pursuing Rachel for fraud, and that I had already signed a lease on a beautiful little apartment across town. I told her I hoped they figured it out, and then I hung up. Rachel lost the house 3 months later. The bank auctioned it for pennies on the dollar to cover the defaulted loan and the legal fees. Her credit score was obliterated. The wedding was canceled. She moved back in with Mom, into the very guest room she had tried to evict me from, and the two of them now live in a house that smells like damp carpet and resentment. I never went back to that house. I didn't need to. I had my binder, I had my peace, and I had the quiet, undeniable knowledge that I had built my own life from scratch, while they burned theirs to the ground. Some stories don't end with an apology. They end with a boundary, and that's enough. If this story gave you the courage to draw your own line in the sand, share it with a woman who needs to hear it today. Around here, we don't just survive it, we understand it, and then we let it go.